These are all images from the Kobe earthquake. And the message that came out of the Kobe earthquake was that the modern buildings, the buildings that had been built to modern standards, to modern safety standards, they did pretty well. The older buildings did not. Okay? So the older construction shows a variety of collapses. You can see partial collapse of this building, kind of collapse of the floors. One of the supports in the corner of this building has clearly failed, and so the whole building is kind of leaning in as a result. This building is obviously leaning pretty seriously, so that suggests a collapse at one floor. So they're probably at the ground floor level. They had a partial collapse, and that's why the building is leaning forward. Here's another example where this is at a mid-level. One of the floors collapsed, okay? And so there's a missing floor here, and that's why this building is leaning forward, and these are all sticking out. This means that these buildings are in serious structural hazard. There's a good chance that these buildings will fall over in an aftershock. Okay? So this is why you get out of buildings once the shaking has ended. But the new buildings did pretty well. This is kind of a nice comparison. These are actually both City Hall buildings in Kobe. This is the older City Hall, and this is the new addition to the City Hall. And you can see the new addition did very well. This building has, again, a partial collapse. If you look over here, you can see these sort of white stripes for each floor. And you can see 1, 2, and then you can see there are 2 next to one another, and then 2 here. So there's been a collapse to this building right here, a partial collapse. And for these, of course, it's these kinds of collapses. It's when buildings collapse. That's what kills people in earthquakes, right? So that's why people get killed, is they get crushed in partially collapsed buildings. So the modern building did pretty well. This is another modern building. It's also done fairly well. However, there's a catch. So you see these sort of stripes. This is not reflection. These stripes here, these are where the glass is broken. Okay, so this sort of the glass all the way down here and down here and down here broke, okay, and shattered. So needless to say, you do not want to be on the street beneath any of these buildings during an earthquake. Yeah. These ones, no. Absolutely not. This one, of course, you can replace the glass. But these are serious, an entire floor has collapsed here. So the structural supports that run the full height of the building have collapsed. This building has to be demolished. Yeah. Why are the new buildings being built out of glass if they can break? Great question. Anybody want to answer it? Yeah. It looks good. People like to get a look out of the window. I mean, all of these things are a balance, right? So earthquakes are going to happen. They're going to happen in Kobe again. They're going to happen here again. But of course, we still have to live in these buildings year-round, right? So it's about striking the right balance in terms of making a building an effective and a pleasant place to work while also being ready for earthquakes. When you look at these skyscraper buildings, it's the same for the modern buildings in San Francisco. These are all steel frame buildings. They are designed to sway in the earthquake shaking. And I'll show you a video of them actually swaying during the magnitude 9 Tohoku earthquake in 2011. So they sway very effectively, no structural damage, but some of the windows do pop out. Yeah. Best building to be in during an earthquake is a wood frame home. Okay? So the wood frame, the typical wood frame house that most people in the US live in does extremely well in an earthquake. They don't collapse, they will creak, the nails will get pulled out a little bit and they'll sway in the shaking, but they won't collapse. It's the best place to be in an earthquake. That's part of the reason why there wasn't many more injuries and possibly fatalities in the Napa earthquake. It was in the middle of the night, everybody was at home. If you go and you look at the damage in the commercial district of Napa, that's where most of the damage was, and if it was middle of the day, there would probably have been fatalities. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, and here is that building fell over. Sure enough, I think a day after the earthquake, this building fell over across the street. So in our scenario of a magnitude 7 earthquake on the Hayward Fault, this is the estimate of how much damage there would be to commercial buildings. This is just talking about commercial buildings. I'll come back to homes in a few minutes. And so they've tried to estimate how many commercial buildings will be damaged on a zip code by zip code basis. The dark blue means more than 10 in a given zip code, and the regular blue means 10 or fewer in a given zip code. Remember, the fault that ruptured is this section of the fault here. And you can see that there is significant damage to commercial buildings over a very large area. On this map, Napa's not quite on this map. Napa's sort of right about here, but it's a much, much smaller area. Okay? So the area where we expect to see damage for a scenario like this is much greater. All right. Okay, so residential damage. In the Loma Prieta earthquake, the headline when it comes to residential damage was apartment buildings, primarily in the Marina District in San Francisco. Okay, so the Marina District of San Francisco is 100 kilometers from that earthquake, but that's where there was a lot of residential building damage. Anybody know why that was? Say again? Because of the soil, that's right. So there's two parts to it. First of all, the Marina District is man-made land, and so it's man-made land is very soft soil, and that amplifies the shaking. So the shaking in the Marina District was stronger than the shaking through much of the rest of San Francisco. And then the second thing is the types of buildings. There are a lot of these apartment buildings. Okay, these apartment buildings, they're all missing a floor. They're soft-story buildings. This ground floor, which has now disappeared, it's been crushed, is typically used for garages. And there are still many of these buildings in San Francisco. You go to these buildings, and there's sort of one wall of brick, one brick thick dividers between garages for all of these apartments. And as soon as you start to have shaking, the whole thing just collapses. The City of San Francisco are taking this very seriously, and they have now just initiated a mandatory program to retrofit these kinds of soft-story buildings because they are such a problem. This is another example, a wood frame apartment building with a soft story. It's collapsed. Again, here you can see how, when you see something like this building is now out of alignment, right? You can see that these columns are not vertical. This may not look too serious when you just look at it from the outside, but this means there's serious structural damage to the building. Buildings, as soon as they are not perfectly vertical, they are seriously damaged, and they largely have to be demolished and destroyed. Okay? So as soon as you see something out of plumb like this, that means that the building probably has to be demolished. From the Kobe earthquake, a lot of concrete apartment buildings, in addition to wood frame houses. So here's a concrete apartment building that's partially collapsed. You can see it sort of tipped over to the left-hand side. Another soft-story building, concrete apartment building that's collapsed. This was the soft story right here. This is actually the same apartment building, but you're... hang on, no, this isn't the same apartment building, but these two photos are taken right next to one another. And so you can see these are wood frame houses probably, and you can see many of them are slightly tilted, and then some of these larger concrete apartment buildings have completely collapsed. So I said this on Thursday, soft-story buildings are the buildings that you have to be very wary of, and they're the ones that you are going to consider moving into at some point if you haven't already done it, while you're here at Berkeley. Okay, on to wood frame houses. So the typical US single-family home, wood frame home that's on a concrete foundation does fairly well in earthquakes. Okay? Obviously there's still damage to some of them, but they are the right kind of building to be in an earthquake. Having said that, the kind of damage that you often see are things like the house coming off the foundation. So this sort of looks like it's fairly intact, but you can kind of see it sort of sort of separating here, the way that these houses originally were built was that the concrete foundation would essentially be a concrete wall, a sort of rectangular concrete wall, and then the wood frame house would just sit on that concrete wall. The two would not be attached, right? Because on a normal day, gravity will keep the house quite nicely on that concrete foundation. Then you have an earthquake and you have a horizontal force, and suddenly the wood frame house sort of jumps off the concrete foundation. So that's one of the most serious issues with these single-family homes. Modern construction codes require the wood frame building to be bolted to the foundation I think it's every 2 feet or something, a huge number of bolts all around the house to make sure that the wood frame is solidly attached to the concrete foundation so that it can't fall off. That is the thing that you need to do if you ever buy one of these houses, and it's an old house, you need to get it retrofitted to have the wood part of the building bolted to the foundation. And then the other kind of damage that you get is sort of add-ons to the house. So things like balconies that are attached to the external parts of buildings, those are typically weak points. So things like balconies and overhanging windows, bay windows, things like that, those are the things that often fall off buildings and partially collapse. And then also things like porches at the front of a building, but they're not part of the regular structure. So this porch here has clearly had some serious damage done to it. And so it's that's that kind of damage that's going to happen. But these kinds of things are not going to kill you unless you happen to be underneath the balcony. That's the point. So even when this damage occurs, and because the interior of the house is going to be absolute chaos, it's unlikely to kill you, although it could do serious injury. Yeah. So the question is, to what extent can you repair the buildings without demolishing it? So that completely obviously depends on how badly damaged the building is. And so if the problem is that as soon as you knock one of these houses off the foundation, because there's no longer any support on this corner, it can cause damage to the structure throughout the building. And so that's why it may need to be demolished. It's not like you just pick it up and put it back on the foundation. But of course, it completely depends on the type of damage. Any other questions? Yeah. So what kind of soil would be most absorbent of the energy? So there isn't really anything that absorbs the energy, but there's the kind of soil that has least amplification, okay? And the harder the site, the harder the rock of the site, the least amplification there is. So if you're built on a solid rock site, you're in really good shape. If you're in sort of firm, what they call firm sediment, then that's not as good, but it's better. If you're in really soft sediment, you're in trouble. Any other questions? Yeah. So why does the softer soil amplify the shaking? Okay, so I'm going to give you the answer. It's a complicated answer. If you don't understand, it doesn't matter. We'll talk about this in more detail. The reason is that when you have a soft sediment site, the actual velocity that the energy travels through the soft sediment is much lower. Okay, so if you have waves that are traveling, they have a given periodicity to them. That doesn't slow down because that's coming from the source. You have slower velocity material, then that means they have to travel more slowly. So the wavelength of the signal gets much shorter. If you shrink the wavelength of the signal, you still have to have the same amount of energy, so you have to increase the amplitude. Okay, we'll talk about this in much more detail so that you all understand in about 5 weeks. Other questions? All right. Okay, so for our scenario earthquake, how much damage do we anticipate? So this is the same sort of scenario. Again, this is the number of homes damaged per zip code. The dark purple is more than 100 per zip code. The light purple is 100 or less per zip code. What's the big difference between this map and the one I showed you of the commercial buildings? Yeah. Shows a lot more damage on our side of the bay. That's true. That's a really good suggestion. It's not the case, unfortunately. The comment was, is it because the S-wave can't travel through the water of the bay? Somebody's either taken a class before or has been doing their reading. So S-wave energy cannot travel through fluids, like water. However, that's not the reason you don't... The S-wave, you still have S-waves over here, and that's because the energy travels through the solid earth. The fault that ruptures here goes from the surface down to about 10 kilometers depth, okay? So much, much deeper than the bay. And so the energy coming from deep in the fault still radiates and is felt over in San Francisco. Yeah. There are darker spots on this map. I think both of the comments are you're on the right lines. The point is that the area where you're seeing significant damage is much less in this map, right? So again, the fault that's ruptured runs through here, okay? And so there's damage on the western side of the fault and there's damage on the eastern side of the fault, but the damage doesn't extend really to the peninsula or marine headlands, right? It's all concentrated around the fault. The area that has had significant damage to residential buildings is smaller. Okay, I think I have them too, right? There they are next to one another. So you're not seeing all of this damage over on the western side of the bay. And the reason for that is because residential buildings are less likely to be damaged in these earthquakes because they're just much better buildings. Commercial buildings are much more likely to be damaged in an earthquake. They're larger structures. They're not these simple wood frame type of construction, so you see damage over a much larger area. Okay? Again, we want all of the earthquakes to be at night. All right, any questions? Okay, of course, the exception to the fact that there isn't damage over a large area is the Marina District. We already talked about the fact that the Marina District had some of the most serious damage from the Loma Prieta earthquake. In fact, when they started to clear up the debris from the Loma Prieta earthquake, they were all shocked to find debris from the 1906 earthquake underneath the foundation. So when we have this scenario earthquake, these buildings are going to be damaged again, and they're going to find debris from 1906 and debris from 1989. These locations with soft sediment, they always have more damage, and it's just a repeating fact that we're going to have more damage in these kinds of places. So it's good to understand historically what's happened to a particular area, because that tells you something about these amplification effects, and therefore the likely damage for future events. And then the other exception to this rule is residential buildings that are masonry buildings, brick masonry buildings. As we've already discussed, these often you have sections of walls that fall down. You don't want to be walking on the street beneath these buildings. You don't want to be in these buildings when they collapse, as you can see here. There's a lot of these brick buildings still in downtown Oakland and in Chinatown in San Francisco. So those two areas have a lot of these masonry brick buildings that are used both for offices and for apartment buildings, and these are the worst possible type of building to be in during an earthquake. Okay? Don't rent an apartment in a brick building. All right, so that's the buildings. What happens to the buildings? What about the rest of the infrastructure across the Bay Area? Well, of course, we all rely on, I guess you guys, when you're here on campus, probably don't, but the rest of us all rely on the highway system to get around for our daily lives. And there's no question that there's going to be serious damage to the highway system during this earthquake. Of course, during the earthquake itself, there may well be pileups on the highway. There's 6 million vehicles in the Bay Area. About 1 million are on the roads, typically. And so during the earthquake, there's probably 1 million people who are going to be stranded in their cars because they're out on the highway system. Some photos of the kinds of damage that we see to roads. It's the bridges, the overpasses that are the most serious cause of concern when it comes to injury and fatalities during earthquakes.
The magnitude of this earthquake brought down a 50-foot section, a caliber section of the Bay Bridge. We understand that there have been cars trapped.
Of all the Bay Bridge images, the most graphic was caught by an Oklahoma tourist, Debbie Kelly.
They sent us down here, surprisingly, in the wrong direction. There's another car. Gosh! That could have been us, but we just turned around. Todd, we need to go down there and help.
I can see a piece of the bridge missing. There's a hole in front of it. She was going so fast, man, she didn't see. She just wanted to get
No one was here but us.
But before nightfall, the awful toll of the collapsed freeway would begin to come clear. Reporter Leslie Brinkley was driving on the Bay Bridge when the earthquake hit.
We were just about several hundred feet in front of the cars that were trapped in that portion behind us, and we came very close to being in the middle of it there. And then all three of us in the vehicle noticed that there were pieces, crumblings, coming from the top of the bridge. And one man described it as being in the twilight zone and just not having any sense of reality. It was all so bizarre, all so frightening and scary. First section of the Nimitz Freeway, and you can see, oh my God, look at that. The freeway has just completely collapsed, and it looks as though there are vehicles down there. Traffic, of course, is completely stopped. Oh, that's pretty frightening. We have pictures of a fire in Berkeley.
So with the Bay Bridge that you saw there, one of the sections, cantilevered sections, collapsed during the earthquake. There were actually no injuries, no fatalities associated with that during the shaking, but there was one fatality, and that you actually just saw that happen. And what happened was the highway patrol were confused about where the damage was, and they were redirecting traffic, and as you heard in that report, they were redirecting traffic in the wrong way, on the wrong portion of the bridge, and you obviously saw what happened. Of course, they just replaced the Bay Bridge. It opened exactly a year ago now, so it took from 1989 until last year to replace the bridge that was damaged during this event. The Nimitz Expressway, which you also saw just before this clip, in case you're not aware, that was actually a double-decker highway, and what you saw looked like a single-decker highway. That's because the upper deck collapsed onto the lower deck, and that collapse was also one of the primary sources of fatalities in the Loma Prieta earthquake, with people being crushed underneath the Nimitz Expressway. And I'm pleased to say that both the Nimitz Expressway and the Bay Bridge are now gone, or out of commission at least, but again, it's taken a very long time. In case you didn't quite catch it, this was actually in Berkeley. This is the Power Bar building, so this is where the BART station is. This is where Charlotte splits right here, so campus is right about here. And so this was a big fire that broke out into the downtown Berkeley area following that earthquake. So when we look at the damage to the freeway infrastructure, it's the same story as with the residential buildings. The good news is that the modern construction does fairly well. The older construction doesn't do very well. This is now from Kobe, again, photographs from Kobe. This is the Hanshin Freeway. Again, this is a raised freeway with a normal sort of surface streets underneath it, and you can see that this entire section has just sort of fallen over on its side. You can see this is the underside of this section of the freeway. These are the concrete columns that have just collapsed. And what's happening here is that you have concrete columns. Concrete is very strong when it's in compression. Okay, so you build the highway, you put the highway on top of a concrete column. Gravity is pulling the highway down. It's very strong under compression, but it's also very brittle. And as soon as you start to shake it, it just fractures. And as soon as it fractures, it loses all of its strength, as you can see here. Modern highways have steel cladding around the column. That's what you can see here. This is just purely steel construction. The steel cladding around it holds all of the concrete together so that you don't have collapse. And so the retrofit that they put into place following the Loma Prieta earthquake, the Kobe earthquake, was to put steel cladding around all of the columns for freeways, and that effort has now largely been completed. Again, with this bridge, you can see the offset. So the Kobe earthquake caused these two roadways to offset by, I'm going to guess, 1 or 2 meters right here, but you can see that it's still standing. So again, modern construction practices are designed to prevent collapse, which means you don't kill people. However, the infrastructure can still be seriously damaged, which of course means that there can still be significant costs associated with it. Yeah. The question was, can you know which highways have not been retrofitted so you can avoid driving on them? I think the good news is that all of the columns, so Caltrans went through a program, they identified the kinds of retrofits they wanted to do, and that's largely been completed. So the question is, why didn't anything happen to the Golden Gate Bridge? The Golden Gate Bridge, of course, is a suspension bridge. The portion of the Bay Bridge that collapsed is the non-suspension portion. Suspension bridges are actually pretty good in an earthquake because the roadway is suspended from these cables. And the cables can withstand the shaking because they have some flexibility associated with them, and the roadway sways, and so they don't collapse. So again, it's kind of like the buildings. You need the buildings to have a little bit of give to absorb the motion without collapsing. That's true for suspension bridges. It's not true for the section of the Bay Bridge that did collapse. The section that is a very rigid portion, and so as you have the motion, what actually happened was that two sections of the bridges were oscillating in opposite directions. They can withstand a certain amount of pull apart, and it just pulled it apart a little bit more, and that's why that section collapsed. Okay, so very quickly, and then I'm going to pause, and we'll continue on Thursday. So when we look at where we expect there to be damage, so we're not really expecting significant number of bridges to collapse, and overpasses have been retrofitted. There will undoubtedly be some damage, but we're not expecting them all to collapse. However, there is still a major problem when it comes to the roadways. These are the sections of the highways, the black parts, that they expect will no longer be usable after an earthquake. Anybody like to tell me why? What's common to all of these sort of highlighted sections of the freeway? Yeah. They're all on man-made land, exactly right. They're all around the margins of the bay. Okay, so this is, I'm going to confuse my bridges, this is the San Mateo Bridge, so the run up to the San Mateo Bridge, and then the run up to the San Mateo Bridge on the eastern side, running through Oakland here. Okay, this is all man-made land. This is the island which has been expanded. You can tell the expanded pieces because they have nice straight edges. So this is all man-made land. The section that runs in front of Berkeley is very obviously on man-made land. And then this section here between San Francisco and the airport, this is SFO here, this is man-made land. So they're all on the run up to the the Richmond Bridge. Also damaged. So it's these sections that are on man-made land. And the issue here is liquefaction. So the man-made land, the soft soil, means that you have amplification of the ground shaking. But in addition, the fact that it's soft, it often means that there is fluids within the sediments. And as soon as there's a reasonable amount of fluid in the sediments and you start to shake it, the entire sediment pile can liquefy, i.e. become like liquid, become fluid. And then it can no longer support the roadway, right? So these roadways are concrete roadways that are just sitting on the dirt. You shake the dirt, if there's fluids present, it can liquefy, and then there's no support for the concrete foundation to the roadway. And so it just sort of slides sideways. And so what happens is that the joints in the highway get pulled apart, and of course, as soon as you have a half-foot gap in the roadway, then you can't drive on it anymore. So this is still a serious issue, okay, is that these sections of the roadway may well not be passable. So you won't be able to travel around the Bay Area very effectively at all, because obviously, if you close all of these sections of the highway, basically you no longer have a highway system that's usable. Okay? All right, we're going to pause there, and on Thursday we'll continue with